The Government of Canada has unveiled a new plan to reduce emissions, and joining me now to discuss this and more is Environment and Climate Change Minister Steven Guilbeault. Minister, welcome back to the show, and thanks so much for joining me. I do want to start out with one question as it relates to reducing emissions, specifically in the oil and gas sector. The plan that was unveiled calls to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector by 42%. How do you plan on doing that without having to scale back anything regarding oil and gas and the level at which that can produce?
That's a good question, Wyatt, and I'm really happy to be back on the show. Our plan is to do this through the use of different measures. One of the things we're doing is we're putting in place regulations that are make it more and more difficult to pollute for companies. And it's not just oil and gas companies, it's every sector. It's electricity production, it's transportation, it's heavy industries, like think of steel and cement. And specifically in the case of the oil and gas sector, we've put in place a regulation to progressively eliminate methane emission. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's actually 28 times more powerful in terms of its warming potential than CO2. And we're en route to reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45% in 2025. And that's already in place, that's working. And we've decided, it was working actually so well that we've decided to increase the target. So to even further reduce that gas being released into the atmosphere to 75% by 2030. So that helps us reduce a good amount of the pollution from the oil and gas sector. We're also investing with companies in innovation, basically to ensure that they become as energy efficient as possible. And thirdly, we will be using a technology, or companies will be using a technology that's called carbon capture and storage. So you basically capture the carbon as it's being emitted, and you store it in old oil or natural gas wells, and you store it there for a long time. There are even technologies where you can capture the CO2 and you can use it, for example, to produce cement. And then your CO2 is captured in cement for a very long time. So through a combination of measures, we think it is ambitious, but realistic to achieve those goals.
And I guess my next question would be, obviously oil and gas contributes to a large portion of pollution, but obviously it comes from other sectors, as you mentioned in your last answer. What specifically will you do to reduce emissions in other sectors, and not even just in public sectors, but also just from people driving to work every day, et cetera?
Well, transportation, after oil and gas, transportation is the second largest sector in terms of climate pollution. And we're doing a number of different things in transportation. We've started investing massively, in fact, historic level investment in public transit. We've never invested in public transit as much as we are now at the federal level. So as we speak, Wyatt, there are about 300 new transit projects that are under construction in Canada from coast to coast. In Alberta, in BC, in Quebec, in Ontario. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're also investing in an active transportation infrastructure, bike paths, for example, that are becoming more and more popular in many of our urban, but also in even some rural cities. Our people are wanting to use more and more their bicycle, either for leisure or even as to go to work. I mean, I've been riding my bike 12 months a year for the last 33 years now, even in Montreal. So it can be done. We're also working with the auto sector to transform the vehicles we produce and the vehicles we use. And we're in the process of developing a new piece of regulation that will force car companies to put more what we call zero emission vehicles. So it can be electric vehicles, can be hydrogen vehicles on our roads. And we have a target for 2026. We have a target of at least 60% of all vehicles sold in Canada by 2030 will have to be zero emission vehicle, and 100% by 2035. And And it is true that right now electric vehicles are more expensive in general than traditional automobiles. But what people often don't realize is that they're much cheaper to operate. So I've had people come to see me and say, I used to have a traditional vehicle. I went for an electric vehicle. Right now, I'm saving $300, $400 per month because electricity is so much cheaper and these vehicles are more efficient. So yes, they're more expensive to buy in many cases, but they're way more cheaper to operate.
I suppose I'll just follow up with that last part because, and obviously, as you mentioned, electric vehicles are, more expensive to purchase at first, but then obviously, you don't have to pay for gas, as obviously gas prices are going up in some parts of Canada. And so that's obviously one thing that, could probably convince people to get an electric car. But how will you continue to convince people to do it? I mean, there's some people who, at first glance will, see the price of an electric car and won't want to purchase it for that reason because it's too expensive. So how will you continue to convince people that, the investment is worth it?
We have actually good examples in Canada of provinces that have done that, namely Quebec and British Columbia, that have put in place a number of measures very similar. In fact, I worked closely with the Quebec government when they developed their system. And what we see in these two provinces, so on average in Canada, about 4% of new vehicles that are sold are electric vehicles. In Quebec and BC, it's more than 14%. Why is it 3 times more in these two provinces? Because they've put in place different types of measures. They've put in place incentive programs for the purchase of vehicles. This is what we're doing at the federal level. They've invested in charging stations so that people aren't worried that when they have an electric vehicle, they won't be stuck somewhere and they can't get electricity for their vehicle. And both provinces are also doing what we're doing now in Canada, which is forcing car companies to sell more electric vehicles in these provinces. And by doing this, they're showing us they've basically mapped the way of what Canada should do, and that's exactly what we're doing.
How will you look at this from a regional approach? I mean, for example, you mentioned Quebec and British Columbia, for example. They're a little bit further ahead right now in terms of electric cars and how they're distributing them and how they're getting sold there, which obviously means that they're probably emitting less emissions from transportation. So was that at all included in the developing of this new climate emissions plan?
Oh, absolutely. We've looked at everything provinces and territories are doing. We've looked at what municipalities. We're working very closely with municipalities. They're an important actor when it comes to the fighting climate change. Worked very closely with the Indigenous communities across the country and national Indigenous organizations as well. So that plan is a very comprehensive plan. It's a very detailed plan. Many have reacted to the plan in saying that it is the most detailed and robust plan that Canada has ever produced. So it was important to us to show a very clear pathway on how we get to meet our 2030 targets.
Okay, Environment and Climate Change Minister Steven Guilbeault. Minister, thanks so much for your time and for making time in what's, I'm sure, a very busy time for you.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care.